Hello and welcome to DataCast Solutions Introduction to Knime for the Data Analyst. In this section I'm going to introduce you to widgets and quick forms. These are the elements of the GUI, the user interface that Knime provides so that the user can interact with your screens to provide basically variables or data points that are going to interact with your workflow. Now, if we take a look down here at the bottom into our node repository, there are two forms under workflow abstraction. There are two sections. One is widgets and one are quick forms. You'll notice quick forms are listed as legacy, meaning these are the older mechanisms that Knime used to provide for interacting with the user. They are being replaced by widgets, one by one. So there was input, selection, filtering, and output, and under widgets we have the same input, selection, filter, and output. So I would recommend, just like you saw with reporting and visualizations, this is where Knime is focusing their energy on making widgets far more interactive. So for my examples, I'm going to be demonstrating widgets as mechanisms to enter data, and that it's going to be broken down into a few different categories. So input are literally things that the user has to enter. So for example, choose from a list box, slider, enter a string, put a date time, choose a Boolean value for yes or no as input. Selection is going to be about choosing things like choosing columns that you're going to be using in your report or things along that line. Filtering is interactive filters where the user will be able to provide filters around what data they do and do not want to see in their report or in their views. And then output is going to be the idea of downloading files and images and text. So maybe after you've created a visualization, you want to allow the user to download that into a PDF file or something along those lines. So we can make use of these widgets inside of our forms. So let's go ahead and build up. Let's start with building up a simple screen, and then we're going to begin to add more and more customization to that screen as we go along. So this is going to be a fairly long chapter, but we are going to walk through and we are going to build a little query that allows me to query my DVD rental for a customer and then bring up all the information about that customer, and I'll show it all interactively on a screen so that we can see it all together. So that's what I'm looking for right now. Is I'm just going to start by gathering the input data necessary to present information, to ask the user what customer is it you want and maybe what date range it is that we're going to look for. So I'm going to start here by building a database query, and all I've done is I've selected the customer name and then I followed it with a tilde sign that has their customer number on it. I've done that for a reason. I could break this down slightly differently, but under the assumption that customers' names may be repeated, I didn't want to search for customer name alone. So I've gone ahead and included the customer number as part of this. So I've just done a select statement to say get customer first name with a space and the last name and the tilde and their customer ID. And now, under my workflow abstraction, I'm going to take a widget and I'm going to take a JavaScript autocomplete widget. And I'm going to go ahead and connect that. And the maximum number of rows, if there is going to be a maximum to say how many can I bring in, the label that I want to put in front of it, I'm going to call it customer name. The description is a help point should they hover over it to ask for assistance. So the description again, please enter the customer name you are searching for. And the column that contains the values that we're going to do the auto search on is displayed in the column called customer. And only accept values from options. I can override it to say they can type a customer that's not in the list. Now, since I've only brought in customers from our database, there's no point in letting them enter a name that's not there, so I'm not going to select that. And so this is what I'm going to pull out of here. And I'm going to go ahead and execute and open the view. And you'll see what the widget does now is it now asks me to enter the customer name. And as they start typing, and each letter, so now the customers will begin to automatically fill in. And as I type Mary, and it's now got everybody with Rosemary, and I find Mary Smith, and that's the person I'm looking for. I'm going to go ahead and apply this value and hit close. And when I look at the output of here, okay, there's the automatic complete string input field, and it's put out the value of Mary Smith. So I've now got the value that the user has selected. But I mentioned that's not the only thing I want to do. I also want to collect in the date. So let's go ahead and figure out how are we going to put the date and make that part of our input field as well. So let's go ahead now and add the next field we want to capture, which is the date that we're looking for. Basically, I want a what's the starting date and the ending date that I want the user to that I want to query for, because I don't want to see every movie the person's rented, just a certain date range. So I'm going to drag the date time widget up here, and I'm going to connect this in. And by the way, I should start giving these names because it's going to be important when I try and organize this. So this is the customer name. This is the start date. And I'm going to configure this and say start date. And the help tip will be show movies starting from this date. And the variable I want to call it, I'm going to say it's the selected start date. And I'm not looking for date and time, I really just need the date. So the earliest date I want to let them select from, well, let's say it's, I'm going to make this 05, 01, 01, and they can go to the latest date will be my database value, which is 2006 12/31. So that's the greatest range I want. And the default value, I could use the execution time, but in this case I'm going to say it's 2005 11. And that's the start date. And if I want to see what that's going to look like again, when it's put on the screen, it's going to look like that. And now I have a drop down, and they can select the date using a very typical calendar view like that, which many people do. All right, now I'm going to repeat that widget. So Control C and Control V to paste it. And I'm going to put this widget out here again. And this one, I'm going to say, is going to be the end date. And it's going to be, I'm literally just going to change start to end. All the way around. Show movies until this date will be my help text. And I execute and show that view. And I can see what that's going to look like on the screen when the user enters it. Now the last thing I want to put within here is I want the user to select a range to say maybe they've rented 1,000 movies. That's way more than I want to see. So I want to let them enter a maximum and a minimum. So I'm going to add a slider widget to this now. Now the slider widget takes as optional input the maximum and minimum values, but I'm just going to hard code mine. and this is number of movies that I want to display. So now I'm going to take this and I'm going to say the label is going to be maximum movies to display. Enter a limit to the most number of movies to display in your window. And the variable, I'm going to call it selected max movies. Now if it had a range column coming in from input, it would tell me that. So I'm going to say the minimum is 0 to 100, and I'll start with 25, so maximum. Now on the slider I can control some of my, I want to use stepping, and I want to show the tooltip. I want to see how many that they've actually selected as they go along. And then if I want to control labels along pip lines along the slider, so I can say I want to pip every 3 movies or maybe every 5 movies. And now I'll control and execute that. And now you can see what this all looks like. All right, see, so it starts maximum movies to display, and it can go from 1 to 100, and as they slide along, they can choose to say, I want to see as many movies as I want to go up to 75 movies and stop there. Okay. Now, I've gone ahead and I pieced together a fair portion of my screen, but there are some additional elements that I want to add to this. I would like to add some text and a graphic. And these are just purely for fun because I want to be able to do that. So let's show how we're going to go about adding text and graphics to our display. So now I would like to include as part of this screen an introduction, if you will, something that simply explains what it is we're trying to gather in the first place. So I'm going to use, now as part of the output, I'm going to use the text output widget, because I want to put some text out on my screen. Not input, but just text. So I'm going to connect all this together, and I'm going to say, now, I can use variables within my text that might be available. I can enter it directly as text, or I can do HTML. If you're familiar with HTML, so you can control bolding and underlining, and any type of HTML tags you can do, you can include within here. I'm just fine right now. I'm just going to put this simply as text, and I don't want a label for it. I just simply want to come in and say, please enter the information for the customer you wish to query. And as I execute and open that view, that's just going to show up. Now I don't like that. I'm going to want that a little bigger and possibly a different font, but we're going to talk about how to do that in just a little bit. So for now, that's okay. I'm getting my everything together. Now the last thing I want to do is I'd like to add an image to it. I like graphics. Everybody likes graphics on the screen, so I want to put an image onto my screen. But this is a different input than we've seen before. This isn't expecting data, it's actually expecting image as an input. If I scroll down, this is expecting the image in the form of an SVG or PNG formatted file. So we need to look at how we're going to go about reading an image from our system and displaying it up on the screen. Okay, unfortunately the process to make an image available is not quite as simple as you might hope. Unfortunately, it's actually going to be quite a few steps to do this. And I'm going to walk you through them. They're not difficult, but it's a number of steps that have to be done. I have to complete a whole series of nodes to make this happen. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to list the files I've created inside my workflow. I've created a data directory, and that's where I'm going to store my image. So if I go back out to my D drive and into my Knime workspace, and we'll scroll down here into the training and the custom class, and we see Scott's example 9, the workflow we're working on right now. You see I've created a directory called data, and I've stored a picture here. It's just a picture of a woman operating a customer service desk, and I want to be able to display that on part of my screen as I go along. So I'm going to come back here now and list the files in that directory. And I can now see that from that location, I've got a URL for that file. Then I'm going to use the image reader node. All that did was I specified the column name that had the URL, and that I'm going to read that image. And as you look at it, you can see now Knime has read that image and it stored it as a row in the table. The next I'm going to use is render image. It's basically going to take that JPEG file and turn it into a PNG file, which is something that the widget can actually understand. It needs a PNG or SVG file. But now this is a table, so I need to convert the table into an image, and that's the table to image node. And all it does again is just give it the column name you want to execute. And now I've got my image, and that's available to me. Finally now I can select that and connect this up. So I'm going to post up here. I'm going to bring all my nodes a little closer here now. And I'll connect the 2 ports here. So I'm building up my screen. And now the last thing I want to do is, again, this is something just for fun. I want to add a little sidebar off to the side that explains, maybe it's called a help window, that adds some additional information. So I'm going to add one more text widget to do this. All right, so now I want to add one more text output widget for my little help box. And I'm going to connect these two together, and I'm going to go ahead, and this time instead of text I'm going to use HTML. And there's no reason, I mean, it doesn't make any difference what I've done with this. It's just, I'm going to call it the help guide, and it's going to be on the side of the screen to display to somebody what it is I'm trying to build all together. Kind of an overall help system, if you will. So I'm going to call this, I'll call it the help guide. Now, I'm going to call this the help desk pick. And I'm going to call this the main intro. And there's a reason I'm giving all of these things names. And I promise you're going to see that in just a few minutes. But everything has a name, and that's important. Because at the end of all of this, what we want to be able to do is see, I can see there's my help guide. Oh, I didn't want that label. And I come back in here and take that label and description out. Make sure everything looks the way I want it to look. And there we go, there's my help guide. Okay, so I've got everything put together. I'm going to save this workflow, and now I've got what I want. The problem is I want to work with this entire thing as one big screen, and that you do with components. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight all of this data together right here. And then I'm going to right click and I'm going to say create a component. And it's going to reset the nodes as part of it. There's nothing I can do. And I'm going to say choose customer. It's going to be my component name. Now, and I might even put some more, enter information about this as part of my description. Enter customer number, start end date, and max movies to display. Now, nothing's coming out of here. There's no data that I want to come out of here, but I am going to want the variables that flow out of here so that I can use them further downstream. So I'm going to right click over my component, and just like we did with meta nodes, I'm going to go into the setup and tell it there's an output port here, and it's not data that's coming out, it's flow variables that are coming out. So I'm going to click OK, and now because this is a component, recall that if I double click on it, what I get is everything that's configurable inside the component. I don't want to do that. I want to actually edit it. So I can do this in one of two ways. I can go into the component and open it. That will bring it up. I find it easier. My quick key is if you just hold the left control key and double click on it, it'll bring up the component as well. So now I'm going to connect my component together to finish this and take the component output. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and run the whole work stream here. Now, what components are a little different is I want to be able to specify in the output. Recall that when we first introduced components, they are encapsulated, which means everything you did to these variables in here doesn't show up in the outside world after it gets, unless you tell it to. So I'm going to come in here and tell it, I want the auto string input, the selected start date, the selected end date in the movie. I want these variables to be visible after the workflow is completed. So I have to tell it that by configuring the component output. And that has to be reset. And now I'm going to toggle back and forth between these two tabs. And I'll save my work. And now watch, instead of individual nodes in here, out here now I'm going to say, show me the interactive customer view. And now you can see all of the information together. And it's been displayed pretty much in not even close to the order that I wanted it to be displayed in. It doesn't look anything like, in fact, what I wanted it to be displayed in. So the next step we have to do is to go into this node, and we have to start configuring it to make the layout look what we want it to look like. So that's going to be step one. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we are going to want to do right now is we're going to want to start to organize the elements of this screen so that the screen is more organized than what we got for random. And that is this toolbar up here. This edits the layout of this component. So when I click this button, now you can see how everything is actually laid out here, and it's all just in order basically. But you can also see the names are here, the introductory picks and so on. I do not happen to like how any of this is all laid out, so I'm going to basically start to insert things the way I want them to be. So this represents two columns. This is a 1-column row, a 2-column row, a 3-column row, 4-column row. And as you just drag and insert them, and you can insert with an insert. So I've got a 2-column row I just put in here. I could insert a 3-column row inside the 2-column row. So you can lay this screen out any way you want. Literally makes no difference what you're going to do. So I'm inserting a 2-column row here. Okay? And I want to start by scrolling down, and I want to grab that help desk picture, and I'm going to delete it from down here, which is going to make it available up here so I can reuse it. I want the screen picture here. That's where I want it to be. And then the next thing I want to do, I'm going to get rid of this autocomplete of the customer name, and I'm going to get rid of that because I want all this at the top of the screen. Now the next thing I want is my main intro. So I'm just going to grab this and actually just drag it up and do just that for now. So now I'm just going to stop here in this moment, and let's just go ahead and take a peek at what this looks like now. So let's go ahead and execute this node now and see what it looks like. I've got my customer selection criteria here, and I still don't have everything quite laid out. And in fact, I think I want to move this picture over here and this over here. And then I still need to put the help guide and the customer name up top. So you get the idea here is we want to move these things around and play with this a little bit. So let's go ahead and come back here. And come back. To my data file. And let's go ahead and start coming back into the layout editor. Now, I've decided, okay, that I want the main intro over here. Sometimes this can be really difficult to navigate. And the picture over here. So I'm going to get rid of this part. Okay, now after this, I'm going to want to put the customer name. So I want that to be that autofill. So I'm just going to put a blank row in here, and I'm going to put the customer name in here. Now, I do want some space on the side for this help guide that I've been talking about. So this help guide down here. So here's what I want to do. I'm actually going to insert 2 columns right here. And in here, I'm going to put in multiple rows on this side. So I'm going to put in one, 2, and 3 values here. So I'm going to put the customer name up here, and the start date, and the end date, and the number of movies I want to rent right there. Now I don't need this or this or this, and I'm going to delete some of these extra ones that have been created. And I'm going to put the help guide in here. And all of these are just extra objects that were created when I was doing some experimentation. So I'm going to delete the rest of these. And finish. And I'm going to save my work. And come back out here and let's see what it looks like now. So the help guide, I like this a little better. The help guide, everything's still not quite right. I want to do 2 things. I want to change this. I want to make this a little better. I want to change the font sizes and some of this. I want to enclose this in gray and make it look a little better. So the next thing we want to do is to put some CSS styling into our display. So that's going to be the next step. Now in this class, I'm not going to teach you everything there is to know about CSS, just like I'm not going to teach you SQL. Those classes are readily available everywhere. I'm specifically teaching you Knime. However, there are some very Knime specific things you can do with CSS. And what I want you to look for is W3 Schools. This is a free online tutorial system that's available to you, and they will teach you SQL, JavaScript, SQL, C. I mean, it's basically just a great big learning center. I absolutely love this. It's one of the best websites I've ever seen. And you can learn CSS. CSS is a language that you're going to use to style objects inside your documents. So setting the background color, setting the foreground colors, the light and black, and so on. It's just what you're going to use. So when you start to work with tables in Knime and start displaying them, they're going to teach you, well, how do you set the widths of the column? How do you make it counter-stripe like that? How do you add borders around it? How do you collapse the border? Get rid of the borders completely? You can see all of these different things that I can do with it, adding extra space between borders. I can add horizontal dividers, and all of this is all part of CSS and what you have to learn. This is definitely part of it. And then within Knime, do a search for Knime CSS. And there is a section here, it'll be the very first one. This is an important thing. Bookmark this into your Knime library. This is a place that will teach you all about the Knime elements in these JavaScript views that you can change. For example, they'll teach you that if you want to change the title, you can set the font size and the font weight and color. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the CSS editor node, which is going to create a flow variable. And that describes what's going on. And your data will actually go into the bar chart. And in your flow variables, there's almost always an option called custom CSS. This is where you can take the object that you named up here, and that's how it will describe all the elements. So you can say, I want the title to be green, the font weight to be bold, choose the font style to be italic, the font size to be 16 point. So you can see what they've done to it by altering. See, they've changed this. They've made this down here to be italic. They bolded it. They set it green. These are just the small little changes you can make. I offer a completely separate class that we're going to be offering that's going to teach you in great detail how to do very substantial visualizations using all kinds of customizations. But that's right now beyond the scope of what we're going to be covering here today. So what I want to do right now in mine is to actually add a CSS editor to start to customize some of those values for me. So what I'm going to do here is I want to add, using some CSS editors, I want to add some colors and customization to some of the work that I've been doing here. And as part of preparation for this class, I've actually uncovered a bit of a bug within Knime, and I'm going to show you a quick workaround to get around the bug. But I'm going to start by bringing in a couple of CSS editors, nodes that I've just copied in, and I'm going to connect them to the help guide and the main intro. And in this one, you'll see I've chosen some titles and I've given it a name of CSS. And this is going to be the colors and font sizes that are going to be used. And on this one, for the sidebar, what I'm doing here is I'm setting a gray background around the help guide text that appears on the left. So for both of them, I need to come in here now into the flow variables and tell it to use the custom CSS variable that's going to control the look and feel of that object. And what's interesting here is if I execute the entire workflow, if I look at the main intro from within the loop here, you'll actually notice it appears proper just the way I want it. Customer selection, and that looks exactly like it appear. And in the help guide, when I show that interactively, it shows us surrounded by a gray box, which is exactly what I would expect it to do as well. However, when I come back out to the main screen now and display it, those settings were not brought forward. So the gray box is gone. So I'm going to have to, I have a workaround to get past that. What I'm going to do right now to get around this bug is I'm going to replace the text output widget with the text output legacy form. It's virtually identical, except I know that this one actually works. So if I take the help guide, for example, and I'll take my text out of here and I'll paste it in here and tell it this is HTML, and I'll do the same with my main intro. Take this text, paste it in here with some HTML format. I don't need a label, and I don't need a label on this one. However, I am going to put the connectors here, and now I'll go into the flow variables and tell it that the custom CSS text, and on this one I'll tell it that the flow variable is the CSS sidebar. So now I've replaced both of these nodes. And I got my workflow all together again. Now, the only thing I have to do is put the name here again. Main intro. And the help guide. Since I've just added these two and taken away the others, they're not going to be where I expect them to be. So I'll have to go into the auto layout. Okay. And the main intro goes back up here. Sorry, I'll have to delete those pieces that are there. I'll put the main intro back up here, and I'll take the help guide and put it back here. I'll finish and execute my node and open the view again. And with a little bit of luck, this time it recognizes the color, recognizes everything that's here. My help guide is now in a little bit slightly different, better position, so everything's looking much better on this screen. The only thing I want to do for one last finishing touch, I'd like to add a bar, just a line in between from here to here to separate the top from the bottom. So let's do that really quickly as well. So adding a bar is actually going to be a very simple thing. I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to add one more text output widget to this. And I'm going to tell it this is HTML, and I'm going to create a bar across just with HTML syntax. And now I want to tell it where to put that bar, of course, which is I want to drag a blank row in between there, and I want to place, well, see, I've called it text output. I should have given it a better name like bar. In fact, I will do that right now. And now when I view it in here, it's going to have the name bar. And now let's look at the output. This time, finally, and now it's got the bar in between here. I'm not happy. I've still left the label in there because I can be dumb sometimes like everybody else. So you remove that label text. And once again, execute. And finally we go back and we see our interactive view now. Now this, of course, the user can work with interactively as you like. That's certainly one thing we can do. What we can also do, however, that's going to be, when you run this as part of the Knime server, it will run through what's called the web portal. And the user will not be seeing the Knime workflow. All they're going to see are these components. So each component is going to represent one screen. So I will build this workflow, and then I'm going to turn this workflow around and we'll publish it out onto a web server, a Knime server, excuse me, and let you see it run natively within Knime. Now, I haven't done, you see, much with colors or backgrounds or anything else like that, all of which is perfectly available to you. Remember, I had you do that search for Knime CSS styling. All of the things that you can change about Knime, you know, I started to show you, are here. You're just going to set it and choose the values, but This whole tab will give you very detailed descriptions of what fields are available when you're working with tables versus quick forms versus containers and groups, so that you can change axis colors and tick sizes. And see, each one of these represents, there's your tooltip keys, colors, captions. All of these widgets and quick forms, you can change their titles, their inputs, what the buttons look like. Everything, you have control of all of these things, and all of these elements are going to be described by these CSS editor. This is simply where you're going to be able to go in and say, all right, I'm going to set my Knime table and tell it the colors I want and the background colors and so on. So you're going to learn to use CSS styling and the CSS styling for Knime, and that is, like I said, almost an entirely separate class that I do cover for those who want to develop really advanced background images and other things like that that can really take your Knime output to a whole new level. This concludes this chapter of the class. Feel free to move on to the next chapter.